Elle. I didn't set out to scare myself. I wasn't looking for danger or some thrilling experience to tell people about later. I just wanted peace. A weekend alone, away from the city, away from people, away from everything. That was the plan. Jeremy, an old friend from college, had offered me his family's cabin. It's nothing fancy, he had said, but it's quiet. That was all I needed to hear. I packed light, some clothes, food, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and a book I had been meaning to read for months. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town, but I didn't mind. In fact, that was the appeal. I left on a Friday morning, figuring I'd get there by early afternoon. The first 2 hours of the drive were easy, smooth highways, a few stops for coffee. But then the roads narrowed, turning from pavement to dirt, and the trees began to close in. I checked the GPS, but the signal had dropped. Jeremy had warned me that cell service was spotty at best. Once you're past the last gas station, he'd said, you're on your own. I wasn't worried. I had the directions printed out. The last stretch of road was rough, just a winding dirt path barely wide enough for my car. The further I went, the darker the woods became. The trees were tall and close together, their branches twisting overhead like fingers locking together. The sky, which had been clear earlier, was now a dull gray. Then I saw it, the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. A stack of firewood sat beside the front door, and a single rocking chair creaked in the breeze. The windows were dark. The place looked untouched, like no one had been there in months. I parked, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. I found the key under the loose brick, just as Jeremy had said, and let myself in. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The cabin was simple, a single open room with a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a door leading to the bedroom in the back. The furniture was old but solid. A hunting rifle hung on the wall above the fireplace. There were a few books on a shelf, mostly about survival and hunting. I set my bag down and went to open the windows, letting in some fresh air. Outside, the forest was silent. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Just nothing. I shook it off. Probably just my imagination. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in. I checked the generator, filled the lanterns with oil, and chopped some wood for the fireplace. By the time the sun started to set, I had a fire going and a can of soup heating on the stove. That's when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping. I froze, listening. It wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from the woods. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. I stood, heart pounding, and walked to the window. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, but nothing looked out of place. The tapping had stopped. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. Just a branch, I muttered under my breath. I sat back down, ate my soup, and tried to focus on my book. But every so often, I found myself glancing toward the window, expecting to see something staring back. By the time I went to bed, I had convinced myself it was nothing. The woods were full of sounds. I was just on edge because I wasn't used to being alone like this. But then, around midnight, I woke up. Something had woken me. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint shadows on the walls. The cabin was silent, but outside, footsteps, slow, careful footsteps moving around the cabin. I held my breath. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking just outside. I reached for the hunting knife I had left on the bedside table, gripping it tight. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Then, a sound that sent a cold wave of fear through me. The doorknob rattled. I shot up, knife in hand, and moved silently toward the door. The lock held, but whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They tested the handle again, slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Then, nothing. I waited, knife raised, every muscle tense. The silence stretched on. Minutes passed. My breathing was shallow, controlled. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard footsteps again, moving away this time. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the knife, my back against the wall, watching the door. Morning came slow. The sunlight felt unreal, like I had spent the night in some other world and was only just now returning. I stepped onto the porch, my body aching from tension. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The prints led from the tree-line to the porch, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the woods. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself it was just some lunatic passing through. Maybe a hunter. Maybe some local who had too much to drink. They were gone now. I stayed. That night, the tapping returned. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, a whisper. Not words. Not a voice. Just the faintest sound of breath against the cabin wall. I slept with the knife in my hand, never truly closing my eyes. By the third day, I was losing it. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. Every sound put me on edge. Every shadow felt wrong. I decided to leave at first light. But when I went to my car, the tires were slashed. Panic set in. I had no way out. No cell service. No radio. No weapons except the knife and the rifle above the fireplace. I locked every door and window, stoked the fire, and waited. Night fell, and the footsteps returned. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. The doorknob rattled. Then, a new sound. Scraping. A slow, dragging scrape along the wooden walls, moving around the cabin. I clutched the rifle, heart hammering. Then silence. I stayed awake all night, waiting. At sunrise, I ran. I didn't care about the car. I didn't care about my stuff. I grabbed the knife, a bottle of water, and ran straight into the woods. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I hit a dirt road, and by some miracle, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved my arms, screaming. The driver, a local, took one look at me and let me in. I never told him what happened. I never told Jeremy either. I never went back for my car. Never asked what happened to the cabin. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some places aren't empty, and some things don't want you to leave. I had always thought of myself as a logical person, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or fairy tales. I didn't seek out mysteries or thrills. That was someone else's idea of fun, not mine. But then one decision, a simple, unthinking choice, changed everything. I never expected to find myself in that cabin, miles away from the nearest town, isolated by thick forests and a cold, unwelcoming sky. It started innocently enough. After weeks of endless work and stress, I needed a break, somewhere quiet. I didn't want the distraction of busy cities or crowded resorts. So, when my friend Laura offered me the use of her family's cabin, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was deep in the woods, an hour's drive from the nearest town. It was old, with no electricity and no running water, but that's exactly what I thought I wanted. A little time to disconnect, to think, to clear my head. Laura had warned me that the cabin was remote, that it was a bit run down, and that I should be prepared for the rustic living conditions. But none of that bothered me. In fact, it sounded perfect. I packed a few days' worth of clothes, some food, a couple of books, and my camera, just in case I found something interesting to photograph. I drove out on a Thursday evening, hoping to get there before dark. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads were narrow and winding, with trees on both sides that seemed to close in more the further I went. The GPS was no help. As I reached the final stretch of the road, it became clear that the cabin wasn't anywhere near any major roadways. It was hidden deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. The air grew colder, and a heavy mist started to settle in. I could barely see a few feet in front of me as I drove, but I pressed on. When I finally arrived, the sun had just dipped below the horizon. The cabin was exactly as Laura had described. Small, weathered, and surrounded by a dense thicket of trees. There was no welcoming light, no sense of warmth. The porch was crooked, with a few loose boards that creaked as I stepped onto it. The windows were dark, and the wood had been weathered by years of exposure to the elements. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bags and entered. The inside of the cabin was sparse. The only furniture was a few mismatched chairs, a wooden table, and an old-fashioned stove. There were no modern amenities, no television, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a bed in the corner, a few shelves filled with old books, and a heavy stone fireplace. The air smelled musty, like something had been sealed up for years. I wasn't bothered by it. If anything, it added to the charm. I threw my bags down, started a fire in the stove, and unpacked my things. The warmth from the fire slowly began to fill the room, and the crackling sound was oddly comforting. I had brought some canned food, but the cabin had a well-stocked pantry. I found some canned soup and a few crackers and made dinner. As the flames flickered and the quiet settled around me, I started to feel a strange sense of peace. But as the night deepened, so did the silence. The kind of silence that's almost too perfect. There were no sounds from the outside, no wind rustling the trees, no animals moving through the underbrush, just stillness. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the isolation, but every time I shifted in my seat or moved around the cabin, it felt like something was watching. I checked the windows. Nothing. The trees outside were barely visible, the darkness thickening with each passing minute. I looked around the cabin, trying to focus on anything other than the feeling gnawing at me. There were no strange noises, no signs of movement, but still I couldn't shake the feeling. The wind began to pick up around midnight, and I thought I heard something. A soft thud, like something tapping against the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. Came again, then stopped. I convinced myself it was a branch, or maybe an animal bumping into the wall. But it was so deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the glass. The trees were moving in the wind, the branches swaying, but nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. I stood there for a while, waiting for the sound to come again, but when it didn't, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I tried to sleep that night, but it wasn't easy. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the shift of the wood in the walls, sounded louder than it should have. Every gust of wind rattled the old cabin, making the walls groan in protest. I finally fell into a fitful sleep, only to wake up to the same tapping sound again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed, my hands trembling. I knew I had to check it out. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but the thought of staying inside and waiting for whatever it was to get closer was worse than the thought of confronting it. I stepped out onto the porch, the air colder than before. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the cabin's wooden exterior. There was nothing there. Nothing. Except the door to the shed at the back of the property. It was ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but it was open now. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Still, I couldn't shake the unease in my stomach. I should have stayed inside, but I didn't. I had to know what it was. I stepped off the porch and made my way to the shed, the ground damp beneath my feet. My breath came in quick bursts, visible in the cold air. As I approached, the door creaked, swinging open just a little more. The beam of light from the flashlight danced across the interior, revealing nothing but old tools and shelves stacked with forgotten items. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. Something or someone moved in the corner. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then I saw the figure, crouched low to the ground, hidden behind a stack of boxes. The figure was still, barely visible in the dark. I didn't wait. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I locked every window, every door. I tried to steady myself, but I couldn't. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Who could it have been? What were they doing out there in the dark? I spent the rest of the night sitting by the stove, the fire flickering in front of me. The sound of the wind outside felt more threatening than before, like something was moving in the trees, something that wasn't the wind. The minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, the sun came up slowly, breaking through the dense canopy of trees above. The mist had cleared, but the air still felt thick with unease. I went outside, not sure what I was expecting to find, but there was no sign of anyone. The shed door was still slightly ajar, but there were no footprints in the dirt, no signs of anyone having been there. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I walked through the woods, took photos of the scenery, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The cabin no longer felt like a peaceful retreat, felt like a trap. The thought of leaving crossed my mind several times, but I was so far out, and it felt like there was nowhere to go. The nearest town was at least an hour's drive away, and I didn't want to leave the safety of the cabin behind. That night, the tapping came again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I packed up my things, what little I had, and left. I didn't care about the storm brewing in the distance or the fact that I had no cell service. I got in my car and drove, not looking back until I was out of the woods and on the main road. I never went back to the cabin. I never asked Laura if anyone else had used it recently, or if she'd heard anything strange. I don't know what I saw in that shed. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. Whatever was out there in those woods was waiting for someone, and I wasn't going to be its next victim. I don't know if anyone else has stayed there since, or if anyone ever will again. But I'll never forget the fear I felt that night, and I'll never return to that cabin in the pines. I didn't think much of it at first, just a cabin in the woods. What harm could there be in that? But if I had known what would happen in those days that followed, I would have never stepped foot in the place. It started with a decision I thought was good at the time. I had been working nonstop, buried in deadlines and emails, constantly running from one thing to another, barely able to catch my breath. I needed a break, a real one, not some weekend getaway to a crowded beach or overpriced city hotel. No, I needed quiet, isolation. My friend Mark had a cabin in the woods about 2 hours from the city. No cell service, no internet, just a place to reset. It was an old family cabin, nothing fancy, just the basics. A small house, a wood-burning stove, a few old chairs, and a bed with a worn mattress. It was perfect. I took a Friday afternoon off, packed up some clothes, a few books, and my camera, just in case I decided to do something creative. The drive to the cabin was peaceful enough. The farther I went, the more the trees swallowed the road, and soon, I was driving through thick forest. It was the kind of place where the sun barely touched the ground, where shadows loomed even during the day. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It was smaller than I expected, just a single story, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The wooden planks were faded from years of exposure to the elements. It didn't look like anyone had been there in a while, but it was still standing, sturdy enough. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, with trees surrounding it like a fortress. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I unloaded the car, unpacked my things, and spent the first few hours getting comfortable. The inside was as simple as I imagined. An old couch, a coffee table, a small kitchen area, and a bedroom with a bed that looked like it could have belonged to someone's grandmother. There were no modern luxuries, no TV, no Wi-Fi, no signal at all. The kind of place where you could forget about the world. As the day went on, I started a fire in the stove. The nightfall came quickly in those woods, and as the fire crackled in the stove, I started to feel the isolation a little more acutely. It wasn't that it was uncomfortable, it was just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy. I sat by the fire, reading, taking the occasional sip of wine, and listening to the night slowly settle in around me. I remember hearing a strange sound as I read. It was soft at first, almost like the faint tapping of something against the window. I paused, listening, but there was nothing. The trees outside shifted in the wind, and I assumed it was a branch brushing against the glass. The tapping didn't come again, so I pushed the thought away. I was just about to go to bed when I heard the sound again, louder this time, followed by a quick scrape, like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled behind me, the only light in the room. I slowly got up and walked over to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I pressed my face against it, trying to peer into the darkness. Couldn't see much, just shadows of trees swaying in the wind, the moonlight casting long, eerie shapes on the ground. There was nothing there. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving through the underbrush, I thought. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every little creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind made me tense. I kept telling myself there was nothing to fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. Something was off. I woke up in the middle of the night to the unmistakable sound of something moving outside again. A scraping. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. This time it wasn't just a vague sound. It was distinct, like nails dragging across the ground, slow and deliberate. I rushed to the window again, my hands shaking. The flashlight on my phone illuminated the clearing, but the beam barely reached the tree line. There was nothing visible. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound kept coming. It was louder now, closer, as if someone was dragging something right outside the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and I almost felt as if the forest was holding its breath. There was nothing there. The porch was empty, no signs of movement, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the silence around me felt like it was waiting for something to happen. I felt stupid. Of course, there was nothing, just a wild animal or the wind. But as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, closer this time, right behind me. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing, just the trees, just the shadows. I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were clammy as I leaned against the door, trying to calm my breathing. What the hell was happening? Was someone out there? I spent the rest of the night staring at the walls, every shadow making me jump. When the sun finally came up, I barely slept. I was exhausted, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. I spent the next day trying to distract myself, taking long walks in the woods, exploring the surrounding area, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were unnervingly silent. The birds had stopped chirping, the wind had died down, and even the rustling of leaves was gone. Everything felt still, too still. As the sun began to set again, I made my way back to the cabin. I had decided to leave the next morning. I didn't feel safe there anymore. It wasn't just the noises or the strange feeling of being watched. It was something deeper. The woods were closing in, pressing on me. That night, I locked every window, every door, and I stayed by the fire, too scared to even think about sleeping. But the sounds didn't come again. It was eerily quiet. I don't know when I finally dozed off, but I woke up to the sound of my car door slamming shut. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and looked out the window. My car was still parked in the driveway, but the door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. I ran outside in a panic, flashlight in hand, my mind racing. The air was cold and damp, and everything was covered in mist. I checked my car, but there was nothing wrong. No signs of anyone having touched it. It was as if the door had been opened on its own. I didn't wait any longer. I packed up whatever I could carry and left. I didn't look back as I drove away from the cabin, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want to answer. I never went back. I don't know what happened that weekend, what I heard, what I felt, but I know this much. The cabin was never meant to be a place of peace. It was a place where something lived, something that didn't want me there. It's been years now, and I still can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, whatever it is still out there in those woods, waiting for the next person foolish enough to come too close. And maybe one day someone else will find that cabin. Maybe they'll hear the scraping too. Maybe they'll feel the silence, the weight of something lurking just out of sight. I hope they'll leave before it's too late. I had no business being out there, alone in that remote cabin, miles away from any sign of life. But there I was, with nothing but the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a weekend of solitude, a break from the chaos of everyday life. I thought the isolation would do me good to reset my mind, but I didn't expect the dread that would creep into my bones, the unease that would settle over me as the hours passed. It all started when my friend Sam offered the cabin. It had been his family's place for years, an old wooden structure tucked away in a dense forest, far from the nearest town. No internet, no cell service, just nature and a worn-out fireplace. At first, the idea seemed perfect. I was burned out, the stress of work and life piling on top of me. I needed a break, and this sounded like the perfect escape. The drive was long, winding through a series of back roads that became narrower and more treacherous as I went. The GPS on my phone had long since lost signal, and I had to rely on vague directions Sam had given me. Just follow the forest road until you see the old sign. The cabin's right there. When I finally saw the sign, barely visible behind the overgrown brush, I turned onto the gravel path. The road was rough, filled with potholes, and my tires kicked up dust as I made my way through the thickening woods. As the trees closed in, the sky above seemed to darken, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like I was entering another world, one far removed from the bustling, busy life I had left behind. The cabin itself was just as Sam had described it, small, weather-beaten, and isolated. The wood was aged, a dull brown, almost the same color as the surrounding trees. It looked like it had been standing for decades, though it was sturdy enough. A large stone chimney rose from one side, and a small porch creaked in the wind. The air was crisp, a faint chill settling into my bones despite the sun still lingering high in the sky. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car, taking a moment to soak in the silence. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful but unnervingly so, as if the world had forgotten me out here. Inside, the cabin was a mix of cozy and neglected. Old furniture was scattered throughout, worn chairs, a threadbare rug, a fireplace that hadn't been used in who knew how long. A small kitchen was tucked in the corner, and there was a spiral staircase leading up to the loft. The place had an aura of abandonment, like it hadn't been touched in ages. But there was something comforting about it too, like stepping into a time capsule. I unpacked my things, set up my books and laptop, just in case I needed them, and made myself comfortable. I had planned to stay for 2 nights, enough to disconnect and recharge. The night was approaching fast, so I decided to get a fire going. I was no expert, but I managed to stack some kindling and light a match. The flames crackled to life, filling the cabin with warmth and the smell of burning wood. As night settled in, the sounds of the forest seemed to shift. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There were noises subtle at first. A soft thud from the direction of the woods, almost like footsteps. I dismissed it as animals moving through the trees, maybe a deer or a bear. I had seen the warning signs about bears, though I didn't think much of them. Still, I felt a slight unease, like something was watching me. I pushed the thought aside, curled up on the couch with a book, and tried to relax. The wind picked up, howling outside as the fire crackled. I glanced at the time, almost midnight. The darkness outside felt thick, oppressive, as if the cabin was surrounded by something unseen, something waiting. That's when I heard it again, a soft thud, then another. It sounded like something was dragging across the ground. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly brushed it off. It was just an animal, maybe a fallen tree branch or something. I stood up, went to the window and peeked out. Nothing, just the moonlight filtering through the trees. I shook my head and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my nerves. The cabin was isolated, yes, but it wasn't the end of the world. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on my book, but the noises continued. A soft scraping sound, followed by a faint thud. It wasn't random anymore. It was consistent, rhythmic, and it was coming from the direction of the back of the cabin, just behind the small porch. I should have ignored it, I know, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and stepped toward the door. My hands were shaking, my breath quickening as I slowly opened it. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting, and I scanned the area around the cabin. The porch was empty, but the noises continued, a dragging sound, as though something heavy was being pulled across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees but revealed nothing. The forest was still, too still. The air felt thick with tension, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. Only the occasional creak of the cabin's old wood filled the silence. And then the noise stopped. For a moment, everything was still again. My breath seemed louder than ever in the quiet. I waited, straining my ears, trying to detect any movement, any sign of what was causing the sounds. Then I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette at first, moving along the edge of the trees. It was tall, lanky, and it didn't seem to be walking so much as dragging itself forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. My heart slammed against my chest. I froze. The figure didn't look human. It was too long, too twisted, like something that shouldn't be out there. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut behind me. My pulse raced in my ears. I turned and ran up the stairs to the loft, throwing myself into the bed. I pulled the covers tight around my body, trying to calm myself, but the image of that figure lingered in my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than before. Every gust of wind felt like a knock on the door. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. The strange, twisted thing dragging itself through the forest, closer and closer to the cabin. The next morning, the sun had risen, and the world outside seemed normal again. The air was clear, the birds were chirping, and the cabin felt like any other remote getaway. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever was watching me, wasn't gone. I packed my things quickly, and by the time the sun was high in the sky, I was in my car, driving away from the cabin. The road seemed less ominous in the daylight, but the thought of what I had experienced lingered, gnawing at my mind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, tucked among the trees. But in that moment, it felt like something else entirely. A place that had been forgotten, left behind by the world, and hiding something just beneath its surface. I didn't look back again. Writing. I wasn't prepared for what happened that weekend. I had just finished a stressful month at work and was craving some peace and quiet. My friend Lucas, who was into all that back-to-nature stuff, invited me to a secluded cabin in the woods. It was his family's cabin, and according to him, no one had been there in years. It was off the grid, the kind of place you wouldn't find on Google Maps. Just the thought of no cell service, no noise, and complete isolation sounded perfect. I didn't even hesitate. The idea of being alone in the woods with no distractions felt like exactly what I needed. We drove out there on a Friday afternoon. The further we went, the less civilization there was, and soon we were surrounded by trees on all sides. It felt like we were driving into another world, where nothing mattered but the land and the sky. When we reached the cabin, it was even more isolated than I imagined. It was small, weathered, and built with thick logs, sitting on a clearing surrounded by towering pines. "Here we are," Lucas said, pulling the car into the gravel driveway. I got out and stretched my legs, taking in the fresh, pine-scented air. There was a chill in the air, but nothing unbearable. The cabin sat under a sky dotted with clouds, and the only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bird call. Lucas grabbed the bags and led me inside. The place looked exactly as I expected, old, but solid. The furniture was worn, but comfortable. The place had a rustic charm. It felt like it hadn't seen a proper cleaning in a while, but that only added to the charm. We spent the first few hours unpacking, settling in, and then decided to head out for a short walk. There was a small trail that Lucas knew about, and he said it would be good to stretch our legs after the drive. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, with thick underbrush that made walking a bit more difficult than I anticipated. It wasn't long before we turned off the trail, drawn by the sounds of a stream we could hear nearby. We pushed through the trees, trying to find a way to the water. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I kept hearing things, snaps of twigs and rustles in the bushes, but I assumed it was just wildlife. After all, this was the kind of place where animals roamed freely, and they had a tendency to make noise when they moved. Finally, we reached the stream. It was small, but the water moved quickly, gliding over rocks and moss-covered logs. We sat down on a large boulder by the stream, and I breathed in the quiet, taking in the beauty of the place. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" Lucas said, his voice calm and distant. "Yeah," I replied. "I can see why you like it out here." As we sat there, the sun dipped lower, casting an eerie orange glow over everything. I began to feel an odd sense of unease, like the air itself was thicker than normal, heavier. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was getting late, so we decided to head back to the cabin. The walk back was uneventful at first, but as we neared the cabin, I noticed something strange. The trees around us seemed closer. The path, which was usually clear, felt more crowded, as though the woods were closing in on us. The sound of our footsteps seemed louder, more intrusive. I looked at Lucas, but he was walking ahead, seemingly oblivious to the change. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the shadows between the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was too tall, too human. But when I turned my head fully to look, nothing was there. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Lucas turned around, frowning. "See what?" "I don't know. I thought I saw someone, or something, in the trees." He looked around. "You're probably just tired. It's getting dark. Let's head back." I agreed, though the strange feeling lingered. When we got back to the cabin, it was completely dark. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about what I'd seen in the woods, or thought I'd seen, but it didn't make sense. There was no one else around. The nearest town was miles away. We spent the evening in the cabin, cooking dinner and chatting, but the atmosphere felt off. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that crept up on me every time I looked out the window into the blackness of the trees. Later that night, after we'd finished eating, Lucas went to bed first. I stayed up for a while, reading a book by the dim light of a lamp. But the silence of the cabin began to feel stifling. It was so quiet that every little creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt amplified. I decided to head to bed, but as I walked through the living room, I heard something, a faint noise coming from outside. It was soft, almost indistinguishable. I stood still, listening, trying to make sense of it. It was a scratching sound, followed by a low, muffled thud, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, my heart racing. I stood there in the dark, staring at the window, but I couldn't see anything. The sound continued for a few more moments, and then it stopped. I told myself it was nothing, a branch maybe brushing against the cabin. I forced myself to go to bed and try to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the scratching sound came back. I could hear it in my mind, and then, in the dead of night, it came again, closer this time, like someone was right outside the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the front door. The beam of light cut through the dark and fell across the porch. Nothing was there, but I felt it. I felt like someone was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. The rest of the night passed in fitful, restless waves of half-sleep, every creak and groan of the cabin making my heart leap in my chest. The next morning, I was exhausted, but we decided to go for another walk. I was hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. As we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but trees and the occasional flutter of a bird or squirrel. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something, a small, abandoned campfire. It was just a pile of charred wood, but it didn't make sense. There was no sign of anyone around. No footprints, no signs of life. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We weren't alone. I told Lucas I was ready to head back to the cabin. Something in me was screaming that we needed to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. When we got back to the cabin, I packed my things. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and I didn't want to wait around to find out what it was. We left that afternoon, and as we drove back down the winding road, I looked back at the cabin in the distance. The trees seemed to swallow it up, as though the woods were closing in again. I still don't know what happened that weekend, but I'll never forget the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't want us there. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there's something out in those woods that no one should ever see. All I know is I won't be going back. I had always wanted to get away, to leave the noise of the city behind. The constant honking, the chatter, the flashing lights, all of it had worn me down. I needed peace, I needed silence, I needed space to breathe. So when I found the cabin tucked away deep in the woods, I thought it was perfect. It was the kind of place you'd imagine yourself retreating to for a quiet weekend of solitude. Maybe with a book in hand, maybe with the calm of nature. The listing described it as isolated, cozy, and surrounded by miles of untouched forest. Perfect for a weekend away from the hustle and bustle, it said. I imagined spending the days hiking the trails and the evenings watching the stars. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived on Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, filled with winding, narrow roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I barely saw another car on the road, and I began to wonder if maybe I had made a mistake. But when I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the cabin appeared before me, nestled against the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures. Rustic, weathered wood, a stone chimney with wisps of smoke rising from it, and a small porch with a rocking chair. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked up the creaky steps, unlocking the door with the key hidden in the fake rock outside. The smell of old wood and something faintly musty hit me as I opened the door. The inside was sparse but comfortable, a single room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a bed covered with a thick quilt. It looked lived in but not overly maintained. Perfect, I thought, just what I wanted. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking, starting a fire in the hearth, and arranging my things. There were no neighbors for miles, just thick forest and a lake in the distance. I stepped outside to take it all in. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. The air was crisp, but not cold enough to make me shiver. The stillness was overwhelming. No birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves. Felt too quiet. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the remoteness of the place. I made a simple dinner, then sat in front of the fire, reading a book as the light outside slowly faded. As night fell, the quiet only deepened, but there was something about it that began to make me uneasy. The crackling of the fire was the only sound inside the cabin, and it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. It wasn't until the sounds started that I began to question my decision. At first, it was subtle, a slight creak from the floorboards, like someone shifting their weight, but the room was empty. I brushed it off, thinking the old wood was just settling. But then I heard it again, a soft scrape, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening. The sound came from behind me, just a few feet away. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I told myself I was just imagining things. The house was old, and old houses made noises. That's all it was. Nothing more. But the sound kept coming. A soft dragging noise. It wasn't constant, but it was there, like a faint whisper that you couldn't ignore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I checked the windows. Nothing. The porch was empty, as far as I could see in the dim light. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe someone standing outside, maybe a shadow flickering, but the woods were empty, and all was still. Then something changed. The noise stopped, replaced by a low thud. Came from the door, a distinct thump against the wood, followed by another. Thump, thump, I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind didn't blow. There were no animals that could make that noise. It was a person, I realized. Someone was out there. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, my body rigid. The air around me felt thick, and the temperature seemed to drop. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then the thuds came again, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and checked for a signal. Nothing. Of course, there wouldn't be a signal. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization. I was alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal or even the wind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I went to the door, checked the lock. It was secure, but that didn't reassure me. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should open the door, confront whatever it was outside. But I couldn't. I wasn't sure what I would find. Then the tapping started. It was slow at first, barely audible, but it was definitely there. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap on the wood. It wasn't a knock, it wasn't a rapping. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. I thought about leaving, grabbing my stuff, running out into the night, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was too dark outside, the woods too dense. There was no way out but through whatever was waiting at the door. I spent the next hour listening, waiting for the tapping to stop. It never did. Continued slowly, methodically. Tap, tap, tap. Eventually, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I dared to believe that whatever had been out there had finally gone away. But then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it again. Faint but unmistakable. A low, almost inaudible whistle. My mind raced. The whistling wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and rushed to the door. I unlocked it, stepped outside, and felt the cool night air on my skin. My car was parked just down the path, a small light flickering in the distance. It would be a long, terrifying walk, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. The path from the cabin to the car was a narrow, overgrown trail, barely wide enough to walk through. The trees closed in on me, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything. The feeling of being watched made every step harder. It wasn't just the quiet anymore. It was the fear, a bone-deep, instinctual terror that told me I wasn't alone. I reached the car and fumbled for my keys. But before I could unlock it, I heard something. A twig snapped behind me. I whipped around, but saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve screaming at me to leave, to get in the car, to drive far away and never look back. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape in the darkness, staring at me. It was too far to run to the cabin, too far to escape in the other direction. It was the longest, most agonizing moment of my life. But then, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, as quietly as it had come. I got in my car, locked the doors, and didn't look back. The drive back to the main road was long and dark, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin again. When I finally made it to a small town a few hours away, I called the rental company. They didn't know anything about any unusual activity. They assured me it was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing to worry about. But I knew better. Something was out there, someone, and it wasn't going to stop. It's strange how quickly a place can go from being a sanctuary to something that feels like a prison. I didn't expect to feel trapped the moment I arrived, but that's exactly how it was. The idea was simple. Escape the city for the weekend, spend some time alone, get away from the noise. The cabin was the perfect choice. Remote, tucked away in a dense patch of forest, far enough to avoid even the faintest hum of civilization. When I first found it online, I was drawn to the photos. A small, rustic cabin, surrounded by towering pines. A big deck with a view of a secluded lake. The description was sparse but enticing. Perfect for a weekend getaway, it said. Private, peaceful, serene. I thought it was the kind of place where I could completely disconnect, leave the stress behind, and just breathe. But something about it wasn't right from the start. I just didn't know what it was. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The GPS didn't quite pick up the exact location of the cabin, which led me down some narrow, unpaved roads. The further I drove, the fewer houses I passed. Soon, the road became little more than a dirt trail cutting through thick forest. The trees felt like they were closing in around me, their branches reaching out as if trying to pull me in. When I finally arrived, I could tell right away the cabin wasn't as pristine as the photos had led me to believe. The wood was weathered with patches of peeling paint, and the roof sagged a little on one side. But that was fine. I wasn't expecting perfection. In fact, the imperfections made it feel more genuine, like a real escape. I grabbed my bag from the trunk of my car and walked up to the front door. There was no lock, just a simple latch. When I opened it, a rush of stale air greeted me, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The interior was dim, only a small amount of light filtering in through the grimy windows. There was a fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area, and a couple of mismatched chairs scattered around. The furniture was simple, functional, but not uncomfortable. I took in the surroundings, not yet noticing how quiet it was, unnervingly so. I set my bag down in the bedroom at the back of the cabin. It was sparse, with a bed covered in an old, faded quilt. I didn't mind. It was clean enough. The sheets smelled of mildew, but I wasn't there for luxury. I was there to escape. The silence outside was overwhelming. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just an eerie quiet that seemed to press against the cabin walls. I thought it was strange, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was deep in the woods. Maybe the wildlife had their own schedule. I lit a fire in the fireplace, something about the crackling warmth of the flames making the space feel more inviting. I settled into one of the chairs, sipping a cup of tea and watching the fire dance. It was peaceful for the first hour or so, but as the sun began to dip behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows outside the cabin grew longer, and I realized just how dark it had gotten. The cabin was in a valley of sorts, surrounded on all sides by tall trees. When the sun went down, it went dark fast. I couldn't see anything outside, just thick blackness, as if the forest itself had swallowed the light. I went to bed early that night, eager to wake up and explore the area the next day. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. I would convince myself that it was just the house settling, the wood groaning in the cold. But after a few minutes of silence, I would hear it again, the creaking, and then faintly the tapping sound. It wasn't much at first, just a light tapping against the walls or the windows, almost like a branch maybe brushing against the glass. But as the night wore on, the tapping grew louder. It was steady, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I pulled the blankets up around my neck and held my breath. I tried to ignore it, but the sound became impossible to ignore. It was coming from outside, I was sure of it. Someone or something was out there. I had heard nothing when I first arrived, but now, in the dark, the tapping was relentless. Then I heard it, a low thud against the front door. I sat up straight in bed. My heart was pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The thud was deliberate. It was heavy, like something or someone was trying to get in. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stayed still, listening, waiting for the next noise. But there was nothing. The minutes passed like hours, and I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The silence was overwhelming. My mind raced with all the worst possibilities, but I couldn't bring myself to check the door. I stayed there, staring at the shadows in the room, my breath shallow and quick. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the faintest sound, a small scrape like something sharp dragging across the porch. That was when I made my decision. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I thought about going outside, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black forest terrified me. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stayed in bed, listening as the noises continued. The tapping grew louder, then softer, as if whatever was out there was moving around the cabin, circling it. My mind raced. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a branch rubbing against the walls in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The next morning, I woke to an eerie stillness. The cabin felt different in the daylight, warmer, more normal. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that I had let my nerves get the better of me. I went outside, breathing in the fresh air, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. But then I saw the footprints. They were clear in the dirt by the porch. Large, heavy prints, like someone had been walking around the cabin all night. There was no mistaking it. These weren't animal tracks. These were human. I froze, staring down at them. My mind was racing. I checked the door. It was still latched, but something was wrong. The latch wasn't completely secure, as though someone had tried to open it. The knob had been turned. The marks were faint, but they were there. I knew someone had been here. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I wait for help? I wasn't sure who I could trust. What if it was just some prank? Some weird person who decided to mess with me? But who would go to such lengths just to scare me? I spent the rest of the day inside, avoiding the windows, keeping the doors locked. The forest outside felt more menacing than it ever had before. The shadows longer, darker. I kept thinking about the sounds from last night, the tapping, the thuds against the door. There was no denying it anymore. Someone had been watching me. As night fell, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every small noise sent my heart into overdrive. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it felt cold in the cabin, a chill I couldn't shake. The tapping started again, just as it had the night before. Only this time, it wasn't just outside. I could hear it inside, too. Slowly, the realization sank in. I wasn't alone. Whoever or whatever had been out there was inside the cabin now. I thought I knew what I was getting myself into when I booked the cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be an escape. No phones, no internet, just peace and quiet. A weekend alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air. The perfect way to disconnect. The cabin was a small, one-story building tucked deep in the woods, far from any real road or town. To get there, I had to drive down a winding dirt path, my tires kicking up dust and gravel with every turn. The trees closed in on either side, thick and wild, blocking out the sunlight in places, leaving me with nothing but shadows and the occasional flicker of light through the branches. When I arrived, the place didn't look like much. The cabin had seen better days. Peeling paint on the wooden exterior, a roof that sagged slightly under the weight of years. But it had its charm. I had checked the photos online before I came, so I wasn't expecting anything fancy. It was simple, rustic, exactly what I was looking for. I parked my car, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked up to the door. The knob turned easily in my hand, and I stepped inside. The interior was exactly as I'd imagined. Cozy, if a little worn. There was a fireplace in the corner, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen area. The floors creaked under my feet, the kind of wood that was old enough to have stories buried within it. I put my bag on the bed in the back room and stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the forest. The silence out here was almost oppressive, like the world outside had been muted. It was so still. No animals, no breeze rustling through the trees, just the occasional creak of the wood settling. It was a little unnerving at first, but I shrugged it off. I was here to relax, not to worry about every little noise. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down in the armchair by the fireplace. The fire was easy to start. The logs had been stacked neatly beside the hearth, and it didn't take long for the flames to catch, casting a warm orange glow across the room. As I sipped my tea and stared into the fire, the day seemed to stretch on forever. The sun was starting to set outside, casting long shadows through the trees. I had considered going for a walk, but quickly decided against it. The forest looked too dense, too unfamiliar. And the more I looked out into the darkening woods, the more I felt a strange sensation that I couldn't quite place. a sense of being watched. It was silly. There was no one out there, just me. That night, I tried to settle in. I read a book by the fire, listening to the occasional crackle of the burning wood. I kept the cabin's lights dim, enjoying the soft, flickering light, but the quiet became too much. My mind wandered, and the thought of the empty woods outside, the isolation, began to gnaw at me. I was tired, so I decided to go to bed early. The bed was soft enough, the blankets warm, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear something, a slight rustling outside, a branch breaking, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the normal sounds of the woods. But as the night deepened, the sounds became more frequent. The creaks of the house seemed louder, and I kept hearing footsteps on the porch. Not the random shuffle of an animal, but the sound of something heavy, someone walking around. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe even the house settling. But the longer I lay there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the walls. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to ignore the pounding in my chest. The sounds were starting to make my mind play tricks on me. I thought, I wasn't used to being so far from civilization, and the isolation was starting to mess with my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that settled deep in my stomach. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. For a moment, I thought I had been dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I realized it wasn't a dream. There, on the kitchen counter, was a fresh pot of coffee, just brewed, still steaming. I didn't make it. I hadn't even touched the coffee machine. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked cautiously over to the counter and stared at the pot. The air was thick with the scent of strong coffee. There was no explanation. It wasn't possible that I had done it while I was asleep, and yet it was there. Someone else had to have made it, but there was no one in the cabin. I immediately checked every corner of the house. Closets, under the bed, the bathroom, nothing. There were no signs of anyone else having been inside. The cabin was as I had left it, and yet the coffee was still there, mocking me, as if someone had just left it there for me to find. I didn't feel safe anymore. Whoever had been out there in the woods was still nearby. They were watching me. Maybe they had always been watching me. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went outside to the porch and looked around, but I saw nothing. The woods were still silent, as they had been since I arrived. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the tree line, hiding in the shadows. That night, I kept the lights on. I locked every door and window, double-checking them until I was satisfied they were secure. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows against the walls, but no amount of light seemed to chase away the dread creeping over me. And then, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. A knock. It was faint at first, just a gentle tap at the door, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. My hands trembled as I sat up in bed, trying to listen. The knock came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was at the door. I felt paralyzed with fear, my breath shallow as I lay there in the dark. The knock came again, but this time, it was followed by a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. My skin crawled. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal out here and no way to call for help. I was completely alone, and whoever was outside, knocking and scraping at the door, had no intention of leaving. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound. I tiptoed over to the door, listening intently. The scraping continued, but it was much closer now. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized that the sound was coming from the other side of the door. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing, just silence. And then, as I stood there, waiting, I heard something even more chilling, a voice. Barely audible but unmistakable. "Let me in."